I am very happy to introduce our next speaker, Professor Naomi Quinn, Professor Emerita of Cultural Anthropology from Duke University. Among her publications, she's co-author with Claudia Strauss of A Cognitive Theory of Cultural Meaning, editor of Finding Culture in Talk, and co-editor with Jeanette Maggio of Attachment Reconsidered, Cultural Perspectives on Western Theory. She is a past president of the Society of Psychological Anthropology and was awarded the Society's 2009 Lifetime Achievement Award. The title of her talk today is Cultural Experiences that Shape the Self.
Thanks. Yvel doesn't know how happy I am to be here. It's because I left North Carolina. Not a good time. So one proviso is that you'll see there's no screen here. That's because I'm so old that I don't know how to do PowerPoint. But I actually tried to do it once, but then I was talking and I forgot to switch the slides, so I decided to give it up altogether. So what that means is you won't have, you can't let your attention wander because there's no crib back here for you to catch up on what I'm saying. So you have to pay really close attention. And you're helped by the fact that I tend to repeat myself, so. Okay, in my one previous publication on the topic of this conference, which was simply titled The Self, I contested the currently fashionable anthropological view that, and I have to apologize to my friends who are here because they've heard a big chunk of this before, but I'm going to configure it differently, I hope. So I contested the currently fashionable anthropological view in that article, that the self is nothing, this is the currently fashionable view, that the self is nothing more than self-representation, or as one author expressed it, an illusion of wholeness. I did so primarily by counterposing that position against recent neurobiological arguments about the self, namely that there are a number of neurological processes which together result in at least partial, if imperfect, integration of brain functions. Is this working? Good. Not just an illusion of such integration, but actual integration, extending beyond the way one represents oneself to the way one feels and acts. Okay. In making this argument, I'm having a little trouble getting this out of the way. In making this argument, I drew mainly on the writings of neuroscientists Michael Gazzaniga and Joseph Ledoux. I cited Gazzaniga's idea that in the left prefrontal cortex there's an interpreter module, what he calls an interpreter module, that integrates information after it has undergone its initial processing in the right hemisphere, making plausible explanations for events. One aspect of the coherent explanation of the world that the interpreter produces by integrating available information is a unified experience of the self. I also drew attention to a number of neural parallel processes that integrate experience, identified by Ledoux, including first, parallel experience of the same world in different regions of the brain. Second, neural self-assembly in regions of the brain that operate as convergent zones, of which the interpreter is only one. Three, downward causation, by which explicit thoughts and memories consciously influence what we notice and attend to, and still other processes that Ledoux identifies as important to our experience of selfhood are, fourth, synaptic plasticity, extending across far-flung networks of the brain, by which connections among neurons that have become strongly associated through recurrent previous experience then fire together, even if only one or some of them have been newly experienced. Fifthly, Ledoux calls attention to emotional states which, as I summarize Ledoux, and this is me in the quotes, play a special role in construction and maintenance of the self because under some conditions they can monopolize brain resources, focusing all the brain's processing on the emotionally arousing experience, strengthening these synaptic connections and facilitating their plasticity, and feeding back into the felt experience of the emotion in the form of bodily sensations and of hormones. Implicated in emotional arousal are 6 chemical modulators such as dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin that are released in response to stimuli that signal such arousal and promote synaptic plasticity and enhance memory so that such experiences are the ones that we are likely to learn, remember, and be motivated by. And 7th, and finally, hormones that have even greater effects than chemicals on the durability and power of emotionally arousing experiences. This is little more than a list of these processes. For a closer description of how each works, you can read my 2006 paper on the self that I already mentioned, or even better, you can go straight to Ledoux's 2002 book, which is called The Synaptic Self. Among these, and I promise I'm going to get to my new argument in a minute. Right now I'm just reviewing. Among these several neurobiological processes, synaptic plasticity will figure large in the chapter of my story I want to tell next. As I've noted, synaptic plasticity takes place not just within individual brain modules and networks, but between them as well. In this sense, quoting myself again, the self is a large interconnected network of synapses that fire in concert. However strong, it should be noted, these connections can also be altered through new experience resulting in new learning and hence new or revised cognitive networks. Also, key to my current story will be emotional arousal, which, as I've already explained, enhances synaptic plasticity. Emotionally charged experiences need to be repeated far fewer times, sometimes only once, to reinforce synaptic connections. And as I've indicated, both chemical modulators and hormones are implicated in emotional arousal and the consequent strengthening of these synaptic connections. I adopt the terminology of cognitive scientists who use the term cognitive schemas to designate the relatively strong discrete networks of neural connections that can result from synaptic plasticity in response to recurrent and or arousing experiences. I need only add that when 2 or more individuals have the same or similar such experiences, they end up with the same or similar cognitive schemas, to which we anthropologists give the name cultural schemas. I will be considering here the kinds of cultural experiences that are predictably emotionally arousing everywhere and hence most likely to have powerful and lasting consequences over lifetimes, the universal but culturally variable experiences that shape the schemas contributing to cultural selves. Okay, I will, although I don't have a PowerPoint, I'll mark the sections at least, and this next section is called The Case of the Pakistani Woman Revisited, and I use it as an illustration of what I'm about. In the previous publication upon which I've been drawing, I used as a foil a case study published by anthropologist Catherine Ewing of a young Pakistani woman she had interviewed. The interviewee disfavored the man that her parents had selected for her to marry, a predicament that must not infrequently arise wherever strict arranged marriage is practiced. This young woman alternated between wanting to be a dutiful daughter and marry the candidate her parents had chosen for her, and trying to figure out how to dissuade her parents of the match. Ewing took this alternation between this ideal of being a dutiful daughter and the pragmatic, if more culturally distasteful strategy of, she called, clever politician, as evidence that the self was a shifting and inconsistent compendium of different self-representations that one could take up or set aside at will. I should add that in a subsequent article, Ewing appears to abandon this view of the self in terms of unstable and changeable self-representations. But in my own way of thinking, the dutiful daughter and the clever politician are not so shifting and unstable. They're elements in a larger, quite stable Pakistani and perhaps, as Ewing's account suggests, South Asian more generally, task solution. In a society that demands deference to elders, perhaps especially toward parents, children learn not to voice their wishes and feelings aloud, but instead to use subtle politicking to try and get what they want. This larger task solution, far from being shifting and inconsistent, is a well-integrated feature of the self-understanding of Pakistanis like this young woman. I went on to speculate as to the three components of early experience through which this task solution was learned. First, through early attachment and subsequent separation from caregivers, children achieve something called intrapsychic autonomy, to be distinguished from interpsychic. Intrapsychic autonomy, as Ewing explains in the second of her two articles, discussing the case of this same Pakistani woman. This term refers, Ewing tells us, to one's ability to maintain a stable inner working model of oneself, including, quote, and here I'm quoting Ewing, an ability to detach oneself from a specific interaction and, quote, and a capacity to separate one's own needs and desires from those of others. So everybody has these, even this young Pakistani woman, everybody who grows up typical. For Ewing, as for the ego psychologists on whom she draws, intrapsychic autonomy is a universal human psychodynamic challenge. Secondly, as they get older, the second piece of this, how children learn this task solution. As they get older, Pakistani children must learn to defer to their parents and other elders, as they also observe others doing, and hence become skilled at suppressing their own wishes and any attendant negative feelings and outward signs of dissatisfaction that accompany this suppression. Perhaps beginning at the same time, children learn to enact what I've called, quote, minor political maneuvers, likely seen and practiced first in the context of small everyday episodes, such as, for one possibility, the art of wheedling choice tidbits of food out of mother and other older female relatives, unquote. I went on to suggest that, quote, gradually naturalized as an acceptable Pakistani way of getting what one wants, this technique will be perfected over time and only later applied to more consequential ends, such as convincing your parents to let you further your studies or dissuading them from a marriage they are arranging for you, but that you yourself do not favor. All these learned components of this Pakistani cultural schema have considerable durability. This is because they are each likely to be repeated many times in the course of infancy and childhood. Moreover, they're all emotionally arousing. As I shall argue, all infantile experience, including that of developing and exercising intrapsychic autonomy, tends to be arousing just because the infant is so vulnerable and dependent, and so might worry about their very existence. Also arousing would be the negative emotions accompanying suppression of one's own wishes and feelings, and the positive emotions attending one's strategic political successes. Both the repetition of these early experiences and the emotional arousal that attends them strengthen the synaptic connections that result and that contribute to a distinctive Pakistani self. I mean, they're not the whole story of the Pakistani self, but they're a piece of it. I would like to take up my story at this point, extending it in this paper. So this is what you've been maybe waiting for. In my Pakistani illustration, what distinguishes the dutiful daughter, skillful politician complex is that not only is it highly motivating, but it becomes an enduring, in fact lifelong Pakistani approach to situations in which one's autonomous wishes for one's own life may depart from the plans that others to whom deference is owed may have for one. I've argued that the resulting cultural scheme is a powerful and durable one because the repeated emotionally arousing learning because the repeated emotionally arousing learning that went into assembly of this cultural task solution is itself highly motivating and very durable. So here's where I'm repeating myself. Here I want to ask from the cultural anthropological side of the equation, What kinds of repeated, emotionally arousing cultural experiences lead to such durable and widespread learning, and hence to cultural selves? Okay, here's a provisional and not necessarily exhaustive list of 8 such kinds of predictably recurrent, predictably arousing experience, beginning with 1, cultural patterns of early attachment, which can have a range of consequences, from the rapt attention and paid to attachment figures to a greater trust in such people, from a tendency to mirror their behavior to a deeper identification and or idealization of such people, as well as, critically from my argument to follow, later defenses against the early dependency feelings that attend this attachment. Okay, that's 1, cultural patterns of early attachment. Second on my list is cultural models of virtue, which is a term I take from Robert Levine, that operate as guidelines for raising a child into the kind of adult valued in a given community, such as, for instance, the deference, in my example, the deference to adults and other authority figures required of Pakistani children. Other such experiences, to continue my list, are provided by 3, the cultural circumstances surrounding childrearing, such as the wheedling and political maneuvering that I speculate Pakistani children learn in order to comply with the requirement for deference, but still get what they want. And 4, the more deliberate cultural practices which adults adopt to socialize and discipline children, including the pattern of punishing children's overt disrespect, while at the same time acceding to their wheedling, as I'm supposing that Pakistani parents do. Still, other such emotionally arousing experiences are, okay, so that's 4, are 5, rituals, especially those such as initiation rites, in which children and youth participate. 6, cultural defenses against shared psychic conflicts, already mentioned in the context of attachment and dependency feelings. 7, shared trauma at any time across the life course, but especially when it occurs early in life, whether it is a cohort that shared some single event, such as the Holocaust, or those that share a recurrent event, such as life-threatening seasonal monsoons, or a more scattered group, such as the survivors of war or of sexual assault. Okay, and 8, and finally, on my list of emotionally arousing repeated events, are cultural idealizations, whether they're idealized occasions such as Christmas in America, or idealized roles such as motherhood in some places, and also especially when these are imparted early. Many of these experiences, like those I speculate created the Pakistani dutiful daughter and clever politician cultural schema, do occur early in life, making childhood, if for no other reason, an especially important topic for anthropologists to study. The experiences I've listed are typically recurrent, even daily, and are at the same time emotionally arousing, and so result in strong motivation and lifelong durability in selves. All can be individually variable, but are also likely to have shared or cultural versions. Childrearing practices tend to be culturally shared, and indeed parents and other child caregivers may be deeply motivated to enact them, and to do so faithfully, especially when they're considered, as they so often are, the only right way to raise children, when they are seen as contributing to the making of a kind of adult valued in a good community, or even if, as with parents who succumb to their children's wheedling, for instance, they're viewed as the only method of mollifying an unhappy child. Rituals, of course, are special occasions typically requiring much preparation, awaited with great anticipation and overseen by highly respected elders or others considered to be ritual experts who bring much gravitas to the event, and they can be deliberately designed to be emotionally arousing, as are initiation rites for their young initiates, for instance. Something anthropologists have studied much. Psychic defenses, to go on to another item on my list. When attempted resolutions to a culturally shared psychic conflict will themselves be shared, or as Melford Spiral called them, culturally constituted defense mechanisms. Whether individual or cultural, such defenses partake of the psychological ambivalence attached to the original conflict they intend to resolve, and hence of the emotional arousal that this conflict engenders. Traumas are always emotionally arousing, that's obvious, as are ideals. To develop the example of Christmas in America a bit further, American adults who in their own childhoods have experienced the idealized Christmas with its gifts, special foods, family gatherings, suspension of daily preoccupations, and aura of happy anticipation, all intensified in commercial and other popular renditions of it, grow up with an enduring nostalgia for this holiday and are motivated not only to continue their experience in adulthood, but to recreate it for their children. The holiday is highly emotionally arousing, in this case, positively so. This is a fairly long list. Here, I'll illustrate my argument with just 3 of the items on it. Cultural variations and cross-cultural universals in disciplinary childrearing practices, in early attachment, and in defense mechanisms. I've chosen these 3 examples simply because, as it happens, I've published on each, and hence I'm in a position to present some detailed illustrative material on how each contributes to the experience of a culturally distinctive self. I must add, though, that before undertaking this paper, I had not fully appreciated the common relation of these 3 kinds of shared experience to the production of a cultural self. My tactic here is to juxtapose them in hopes of bringing home this commonality, while at the same time encouraging those who study other phenomena on my list, such as ritual or whatever, to consider them in this new light. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about disciplinary practices cross-culture. This is actually my longest section. And I wrote about this in an earlier paper, 2005 paper. And so I'll begin with it because it's perhaps the simplest illustration. Reading the anthropological literature on this topic, on disciplinary practices cross-culturally, I noticed an interesting parallel across what initially had seemed a wide and unrelated variety of such practices, including most prominently beating, frightening, teasing, shaming, praising, and depriving. The use of these is not mutually exclusive in a given society, though one or another practice may be primary in the sense of the most frequently resorted to. Beating and frightening abound in the ethnographic literature. As for beating, in the town where I worked in southern Ghana, my own fancy field site on coastal Ghana, it was said that children must learn nsuro obai, to fear the stick, if they're to become obedient. This being, I guess, the fancy version of our own time-honored dictum, spare the rod and spoil the child. Branches taken from a special bush, known for their elasticity, were stripped for use in caning, as it was called in English. The technique of frightening also ranges wildly and includes the appearance of menacing masked figures, along with threats that these monsters plan to kidnap and eat the recalcitrant child, intended to frighten such children into obedience in many oceanic societies, for instance. In Fancy Town, where I worked in Ghana, frightening in this way was more impromptu. A misbehaving child would be threatened that local policemen sweeping through the town on the hunt for some lawbreaker would take the miscreant away. Indeed, I myself, a sufficiently scary figure with my pale skin and flyaway hair, who also served as a boogeyman, with adults warning disobedient children that I would carry them away to America, with the result that whenever I walked through town, children would run screaming from me. For a quite different Ghanaian example, a woman from Accra once told me that she had a lifelong fear of roosters due to being told when she was a small child that the household rooster who dominated their courtyard would get her and eat her if she was bad. And remember that the rooster was not only aggressive, but at least half the height of this toddler. So, my next illustration of teasing as a primary disciplinary technique comes from Jean Briggs's amazing 1998 book, Inuit Morality Play, some of you may know, about the socialization of 3-year-old Chubby Mata. Inuit adults initiate what Briggs named dramas, questioning children about important cultural dilemmas in a playful way and with a special, soft, teasing voice. But an activity that was often quite obviously discomforting for the targets of this interrogation. Inuit themselves call this, quote, and I can't pronounce the Inuit really, causing someone to think is the translation. To illustrate shaming, I turn to the Chinese case so beautifully documented in a series of articles by Peggy Miller, Heidi Feng, and their colleagues, comparing socializer-child co-narration in Chicago and Taipei. Chinese parents shame their children for bad behavior by subsequently, publicly, and with evident relish often, giving an account of the earlier incident of misbehavior, coaxing the child to co-narrate the story, and castigating the child all over again for the earlier behavior being retold. Aptly, they call this practice opportunity education. At least that's the English translation that's given. The fact that in both the Taiwanese and the Inuit cases, the technique is named captures the deliberateness of its use by parents and other socializers. Okay, but another less deliberate example of shaming is provided by Bambi Chapin, another anthropologist, from her fieldwork in a Sri Lankan Sinhala village. Given the permissiveness of parents toward what was in Chapin's American eyes the overly demanding behavior of toddlers, she was surprised by the seemingly magical transformation of these demanding little creatures into characteristically compliant, restrained, and self-denying older children beginning when they were about 5 years old, and at least by the time they were 10. Following up a clue from her participant observation, the repeated claim of mothers that, quote, we have to give these children what they want. Chapin more closely observed actual incidents of mothers and others ceding to childish demands. And she noticed that these adults would invariably give in to small children, yes, but that this granting of their demands would be accompanied by signs of ambivalence, such as winces, disgust faces, and a negative withdrawing emotional tone, so that children got what they wanted, but at the cost of disapproval and even dislike. Eventually, they stopped asking for what they wanted. Chapin concluded that the mother's ambivalent behavior had to do with their own covert wish to recapture what they desired through their children, coupled with their simultaneous reproduction of the same cultural disapproval that they themselves had earned in discouragement of their own childish desires when they themselves had been small. It's a bit of a complicated argument. American mothers, however, generally react to all these various techniques I've described so far as overly harsh, even tantamount to child abuse, while mothers from elsewhere think that Americans spoil their children. For a great example, some of you may know, for a great example of this evaluative dichotomy, you can read Amy Chua's 2011 book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. The main reason why American middle-class parents may be loath to beat, shame, frighten, tease, or otherwise disapprove of their children's behavior is that they fear to undermine the children's self-esteem. Indeed, this may be a more general concern of middle-class parents and other socializers in post-industrial societies wherever individualism reigns and healthy self-esteem is considered key to individual success in the world. In response to this concern for preserving self-esteem, middle-class parents everywhere are more likely to employ positive, or at least mild, disciplinary tactics. The special praise voice parents use to mark their child's every small achievement is immediately recognizable to middle-class Americans. It's a good girl, good boy. All us parents have used it. Another very common practice of these parents and also teachers, is timeout, which deprives the child of ordinary human interaction and pursuits without endangering his or her self-esteem. Heather Ray Espinosa provides a different ethnographic example of such deprivation for middle-class families in Guayaquil, Ecuador. These parents routinely give their children candy, cookies, and other sweets. Moreover, everywhere these families go in the city, in stores, at kiosks, and even on buses, these treats and other small gifts are sold, and the parents buy them for their children. As Ray Espinosa says, the treats are not conditional. Their absence is. Misbehaving children are deprived of treats, and equally, if not more important, excluded from the associated social events, like running errands in town. Ray Espinosa describes one incident in which a small child, refusing to eat her food, stomped away from the table in the middle of dinner. As she recounts, the parents, quoting Espinosa here, Ray Espinosa, the parents decided that one of them should go to the store to make sure that the little girl was not rewarded for leaving the dinner table. Running out of her room when she heard him leave, the girl was devastated to find that her father had departed to go on the errand without her. When they're more or less deliberate cultural strategies, like most of those I've recounted, there are several ways in which disciplinary practices are often contrived to convey maximally enduring lessons to children. First, socializers often engineer the child's experience of these lessons to be exceptionally constant. This means not only carrying out the disciplinary practices themselves consistently and from an early age, but also screening out other possibly contrary messages. By this constancy of repetition, the neural associations being learned become strong. Thus, New York City parents, described by Suzanne Pelka, believing that consistency is important, make it a point not to deviate from their disciplinary routine, and they also disallow the father of one of them who's living with them from ever himself disciplining the children. While these parents and others living in complex urban societies, often dubbed individualist in the literature, promote constancy by denying others the right to discipline their children, in smaller village societies known as collectivists, such exclusion of other potential disciplinarians is not necessary because there's such widespread community agreement on the right way to bring up children. Next, the discipline is often coupled with marked disapproval or approval on the part of the adult doing the disciplining, as well as any witnessing adults and even older children, adding a powerful layer of motivation to the process. That is, not only does the child want to avoid beating or shaming or earning praise or privileges, but wants also to avoid the disapproval and earn the approval of primary caretakers and other older people around him or her. In their different ways, both constancy and approval and disapproval thus heighten the child's receptivity to what is to be learned. Finally, the lessons taught by disciplinary techniques are often presaged by what I have called predispositional priming, breaking socialization into a two-step process. First, the child is predispositionally prepared to be socialized in a certain way, so the subsequent socialization of this kind will be effective. Thus, fancy adults place the switch in a prominent place in the courtyard, reminding all resident children to fear the stick even before it may actually have to be used on a misbehaving child. Pakistani children's small early successes at wheeling food prime them, as I have speculated, for the more consequential political maneuvers of adolescence and beyond. Likewise, American middle-class parents, with their praise for the children's small early successes, the more precocious the better, such as pooping in the potty or tying their shoes, not only teach the child the value of that particular achievement, but also these parents hope to instill in them a generalized self-reliance that will, it is thought, stand them in good stead in their future pursuit of success and happiness, which is tied to success. These parents can sometimes be explicit about their intent to train their children in self-reliance by accompanying these early challenges with general messages about it, or contriving them especially for this purpose. Think of, for instance, The rationale in terms of promoting self-reliance that American parents often give for the widespread middle-class custom of sending children to overnight camp during summer vacation. It makes them self-reliant. Socializers elsewhere may be even more deliberate about such pre-training. Taiwanese parents use that name opportunity education to begin instilling in a small child the values that will contribute to their later becoming a virtuous adult. Fung describes the expressed Taiwanese belief that only a person raised from the beginning to be sensitive to shame, that is, to other people's opinions, evaluations, and judgments, will be motivated to strive for improvement, so as to ultimately internalize a strong sense of the upright conduct that represents the Chinese cultural ideal of such an adult. And Inuit socializers cause children to think about small, everyday, hypothetical situations that, like, do you want to come live with me, or why don't you give me that puppy of yours, that, as one author put it, are understood by these Arctic people to be a training ground that helps to turn them into adults who have internalized the values of their group. Taiwanese and Inuit socializers don't wait for chance occasions for their children to begin learning cherished values. They contrive such occasions. In neural terms, it's clear such predispositional priming by habitually rewarding certain behaviors and discouraging others is another tool available to socializers to move their children in the direction of becoming the valued adults they intend to raise, and thus having the kind of cultural self that's typical of that society. Of course, in cases like that described by Chapin for the Singhalese villager sea study, not only are such deliberate advanced strategies absent, but by giving in to children's desires, socializers seem, surprisingly, to be training them in behaviors opposite to the ideal. But children learn to be the kind of people valued in that society anyway, because these socializers are conveying, albeit unintentionally rather than more deliberately, and these children are receiving the message that the behavior in question, though it is being catered to at the moment, is really strongly disapproved. Such disapproval apparently trumps the immediate concrete reward that children experience. And this early experience of being simultaneously gratified and disapproved predisposes these children to be self-denying thereafter. Ultimately, children internalize the habits they've been rewarded for, inhibit those that have been punished, for, rewarding themselves for good behavior or punishing themselves for bad. In the end, they internalize specific cultural brands of approval for being deferent, for instance, or upright or self-reliant. More generally, culturally shared disciplinary practices contribute to characteristic cultural selves. Self-denying Singhalese who continually parse the hierarchical world they live in so as to know what to express or expect, when to express or expect appropriate deference. Independent Americans heading out on their own to seek success and happiness. Virtuous Chinese who devote their lives to following the path of right conduct. And interpersonally cautious Inuit who, even as adults, continually test relationships. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to two shorter sections. The first is two cultural examples of attachment, just to give you a sense of the range of what I'm talking about. And this is an even earlier experience, that of attachment, that also has a great deal to do with the way we experience ourselves. How am I doing on time? Okay. My attention was first drawn to attachment during a study of American marriage that I conducted, and it was based on multiple separate hour-long interviews with 22 husbands and wives in 11 marriages. At some point, a colleague asked me how it was that I could analyze American marriage without ever addressing love. This remark sent me back to my interviews and an analysis of all the mentions of love therein. I found a striking parallel between love and marriage in these Americans' understanding of them. What interviewees had to say about marital love was related to their discourse about marriage in two ways. First of all, love and marriage were coterminous, were considered to be coterminous. That is, if you fell in love with someone, you were expected to marry them. Married people were expected to love each other. And if, for whatever reason, one or both fell out of love with the other, they were expected to divorce. Secondly, the three fundamental expectations interviewees had about marriage matched the three observations they made about marital love, to wit, marriage was expected to be mutually beneficial in the sense of fulfilling to both, shared in the sense of a life together, and lasting. Likewise, you wanted to fulfill and be fulfilled by the person you loved, to be close to them, and to stay with them forever. Considering this triadic parallel, I speculated that the pattern originated in the early infant caregiver attachment relationship. That's how I got into attachment in the first place. You expect the caregiver, or when there are multiple caregivers, to fulfill your needs. You want to stay near that person or those people, and you fear abandonment by her, him, or them. Attachment theorists, I think, would agree that these impulses in human infants are an evolved adaptation to their especially long period of immaturity and their vulnerability to harm, or even mortality during that time. Whatever. Thus, in my account, adult love relationships are a refinding, as Freud termed it, of infantile experience, while marriage is, in turn, the institutional realization of adult love. Subsequently, I compared the case of American love with a very different case of Fungo, an important emotion for Ivalic Islanders, reported on in a fine ethnography of emotions on that Micronesian atoll by Catherine Lutz. I showed, and so I hope you're appreciating all these ethnographic examples. I showed that Fungo shares the same three fundamental concerns traceable to infancy, I've argued, as does love, but that these concerns are very differently configured and differently distributed across people in the two places. In short, the notion of Fungo expresses care not just for one other person, but for all who are young, old, sick, or otherwise needy. On this small island, in which almost everybody's related somehow, Fungo is most often felt toward kin. Fungo is the central emotion felt toward those who have died or are dying, and those from whom one has been separated, or from whom separation is intimate, typically because the other person is leaving the island. That is, these are contexts not of, the first was context of care, and these are contexts of threatened or actual loss. Finally, Fungo is felt for those who have no kin, for the prescription for what to do when overtaken by Fungo is to be with people, and those without kin are severely hampered in this regard. Thus, as Lutz summarizes, Fungo, and I'm quoting her here, puts cultural emphasis on the links between loss, interpersonal connection, and others' needs. I argue that an analysis that traces these three concerns back to the preoccupations of infancy and early childhood makes sense of their linkage in a single word. Just so, an analysis makes sense of the way that the married Americans I interviewed think and talk about marital love. Once again, the early experiences from which both originate are powerfully emotionally arousing, accounting for their depth of motivation and their durability across the life course. While the two emotions have common roots in universal early human experience, they take radically different cultural shapes, as do the kinds of selves distinctive of each society, to the degree that those selves are shaped on the one hand by ideas about the importance of having someone to love in a one-to-one relationship, on the other hand by ideas about the importance of being known as one who exercises Fungo towards those deserving of it. So those are two radically different kinds of cultural self. Okay, this is my final discussion of one other item on my list, which is cultural defenses. So here I'm going to talk about two different cultural defenses. And my illustration of this follows directly from my story about attachment. This is because attachment sets up a universal psychic conflict between the dependency that we humans enjoy as infants and the autonomy that all societies require of us in adulthood. I follow psychoanalytic theory in supposing that people everywhere contrive defenses against profound and otherwise unmanageable psychic conflicts such as this one. When the conflict is shared by members of the group, so will be the defense. It will be a culturally provided resolution of that shared conflict. There are, of course, other such psychic conflicts equally widely experienced cross-culturally, and hence presumably other cultural defenses against these. For instance, one such is the conflict that Bem highlights between what he calls egoism and altruism, and that commonly evinces itself in contemporary American marriage as the tension between the expectation of autonomous self-fulfillment and the equally powerful expectations that this satisfaction be mutual and that marital life be shared. So autonomy and mutuality are in tension. Defenses consist first of disavowal of the conflictual feeling, in the case I'm talking about infantile dependency, and then disposal in some way of that which has been disavowed. To give as examples two well-known kinds of defense that will figure in the account I'm about to give, in what is called reaction formation, one feels and displays something that is the reverse of the disavowed trait or behavior, and in projection, it's others who feel and display it, not oneself. The typically American cultural defense against feelings of dependency left over from infancy has been discussed by Chris McCollum in the context of a set of Americans falling in love stories that he collected. He argues from his analysis of these stories that this defense is a robust kind of, the American defense, robust kind of reaction formation embodied in much vaunted American self-reliance. Not only are Americans not dependent, they're super independent. This is a stance widely exhibited in American society from an array of child-rearing practices, such as the aforementioned practice of sending children away to overnight summer camp so they'll learn to be self-reliant, to an everyday unwillingness to be in any way beholden to friends and neighbors, to the political philosophy of small government and its Ayn Randian version of unapologetic denial of any communal obligations at all in favor of pure self-interest to which many Americans subscribe, which is, another version of the denial of dependency. To the degree that Americans still experience some unwanted feelings of dependency, they can channel those feelings into the narrow context of marriage or other intimate relationships, which take their intensity from that burden. McCollum goes on to suggest that even in marriage, Americans employ further defenses that preserve the fiction of their autonomy in relation to their spouse. Under the general rubric of the defense, which is called compromise formation, McCollum recognizes a twofold strategy against felt loss of autonomy within intimate relationships. Americans, he says, preserve a sense of this autonomy by way of the paradoxical belief that one must establish oneself as fully autonomous before falling in love. So you shouldn't, for instance, marry someone on the rebound. And Americans, again, disguise any remnants of felt dependency by transferring agency from the self to the external world, the rationalization being that one has no control over the person with whom one falls in love. So it's not your dependency. It's not an expression of your dependency. It's just something that strikes you like lightning. Moreover, any such feelings and lingering expressions of dependency may be muted or out of awareness, and so may be hard to detect for the average person to detect. For instance, a few husbands and wives interviewed for my study of American marriage admitted to using baby talk to each other. I consider this, although they didn't, I consider this usage a clear attribution of infant-like dependency feelings on the part of the spouse being baby talked to, what you might think of as a leakage of these dependency feelings. But I could not tell how widespread this practice might be. More widespread than we might suppose. Imagine my surprise one day when my son-in-law was a bit under the weather, overhearing my daughter, my very independent daughter, inquiring of him in baby talk how he was feeling. Married Americans may also baby each other in other ways. Thus, one of my interviewees observed that her husband, and here I'm quoting hers, quote, spoils me rotten at times. For instance, changing the channel on the TV for her so she won't have to get up from the couch. After the 7 o'clock news, she goes on to report, quote, wrap the Afghan around me, turn down the game shows, turn off the lights, and kiss me goodnight for an hour. I mean, he really does spoil me, and I really like it. So, but Implicit Fungo is also defensive. The Implicit version of this defense against infantile dependency feelings, although it also involves reaction formation, is quite different than the American version. Implicit Islanders are unable to disavow any dependency they might otherwise feel by a combined strategy of projection and reaction formation. That is, neediness is felt by others, not by oneself, and one experiences oneself instead as being the one who cares for those needy others. Instead of the marked self-reliance of Americans, the Implicit defense is founded on an equally pronounced enactment of caregiving. As an aside, it's compelling that the founder of attachment theory, John Bowlby, encountered in his British clinical practice some individual cases of what he called compulsive caregiving for others, remarkably similar to Fungo. As Bowlby observed about these cases, and here I'm quoting him, because a compulsive caregiver seems to be attributing to the cared for all the sadness and neediness that he is unable or unwilling to recognize in himself, the cared for person can be regarded as standing vicariously for the one giving the care. So these individual clinical cases of compulsive caregiving for others encountered by Bowlby might be viewed as a nascent, undeveloped, and uninstitutionalized version of the Implicit cultural defense of Fungo. The same could be said of the practice of consistently talking baby talk or otherwise babying one's spouse on given occasions. In both the Implicit and the American cases, the defensive disavowal of any dependency feelings of one's own, engaging as it does the conflict between deeply felt infantile dependency and adult demands for autonomy, gains its emotional arousal from the felt ambivalence around the psychic conflict it addresses but never fully resolves. On the grounds of this arousal, as well as the frequent repeated practice in enacting each of these defenses, is shaped a culturally distinctive aspect of the self and self-understanding. On the one hand, a self who is sturdily self-reliant, and on the other hand, a consummate caregiver. Okay, finishing up the larger point, I'll just try to restate. The culturally distinctive selves resulting from the kinds of repeated, emotionally arousing, mostly early cultural practices of the sort I've been describing remain to a substantial degree unmarked. They're what Ledoux termed implicit selves. This lack of awareness helps in the disguise of dependency that is deemed inappropriate for adults to express. But sometimes we do consciously reflect upon ourselves, ending up with explicit ideas about who we are, and sometimes we have the help of outsiders like what's his name, who came and studied the Americans back in colonial days, the Frenchman. Yeah. But sometimes we are explicit and we are self-conscious about, and we do reflect upon ourselves and who we are. And these ideas about ourselves taken together are what we may want to call identity. So, in this way of thinking, one's identity identities are just an aspect of oneself. To interpret these identities to ourselves so that we may understand ourselves better, make sense of our place in our society as we are prone to do, we typically draw upon ready-made named cultural versions of them that I've been discussing, whether these culturally recognized identities are traditional, recent, or even oppositional ones. To restate the larger point of these three cases of culturally shared practices of disciplining children, patterns of adult behavior derived from early attachment, and cultural defenses arising from early psychic conflicts. What all of them have in common and shares well with the other experiences surrounding childrearing, ritual, trauma, and idealization that I've listed is that firstly, they are all repeated and hence rehearsed multiple times in the course of early life, either due to the diligence of parents and other child socializers, or simply due to the frequency in which situations exposing children to these experiences arise in that society. Secondly, they're all quite emotionally arousing to the infant young child. Hence, I want to argue they are among the most motivating, enduring experiences that people have, whether implicit or explicit in people's understanding of such culturally shared and culturally distinctive practices profoundly influence who we become, in other words, ourselves. And I have another paragraph, but it's sort of should be a footnote, so I'll stop.